Well,
Sorry.
anytime that I've done like karaoke or anything like that, people have been really good about they'll take the mic back and then they'll wipe it down with alcohol and then hand it to the next person. And yeah, so they're in some places pretty conscious of that.
Oh yeah, they certainly are in
Yeah.
Japan because people still do karaoke here, and like
Sure, yeah.
this microphone's okay, but the thing is, they would spray them at these, even in the divey clubs. They'd spray them in the '90s even, but
Oh
they just
wow,
have like a
good.
black tip, like you just know that like 3,000
It's
people
yeah.
have spit onto this, so and now you have
Yep.
to basically eat it if you want to be heard in a club. But and that's how I podcast now. But at least I know it's my mic, right? So nobody else
Yeah,
uses this mic.
exactly.
This is my mic.
Exactly.
To a little Full Metal
Funny.
Jacket there. How's your trip? I need to make your trip sometime soon because I think it's been 2010 since I've been in my house.
Yeah, man, it's well, it's been a lot, I mean, it is great to be here and it's very comforting to be at home and there's a lot of good food and a lot of good people to see. But, this has all been a challenge. Every day we're having to do multiple physical therapies and stuff with my dad, and it's just it's a whole different paradigm from the last time I saw him,
Yeah,
you
my
know.
concern is it'll be that when I like my parents are mid 70s now and they're planning to come
Yeah,
here in October. They come out to Japan every few years, but I haven't made my
yeah,
way that way. So, but I'm going to
right,
need to
right.
hopefully under before it's like more serious circumstances, but
Yeah, yeah,
there's no
yeah.
like there's
Uh,
just how life rolls, right?
exactly, exactly. Yeah. Let's see here. I've got your note. Sorry, I'm because I'm using a borrowed computer for recording. I have the notes open, your notes open here on an iPad.
Okay. Yeah,
So
no problem at all. So like
yeah,
I basically send them as a courtesy because I think, some people like I don't tend to read the other person's notes, but
yeah, yeah, yeah.
but some people like to.
Um,
So, like
yeah. Well, no, I've got it open here for the monologue. Um,
oh, you've got that, so I don't need to screen it. Okay. That's cool.
yeah,
Because it's a
yeah,
long, yeah, I think this one's too long to fit
yeah,
on the Zoom
yeah. It's
screen.
pretty big. Yeah. All
Okay. I guess
right.
we'll bump on into this then. Let me give just a 5-second gap that I can cite on the sound file and we'll go.
Cool.
Hello, welcome to Time Enough Podcast. It's where we get into episodes of The Twilight Zone and beyond. This is Matt here. Joining us again from the Mission Log podcast is John Champion. Howdy.
Hey, thank you for having me on this, light, refreshing little walk in the park that is Death's Head Revisited, the Twilight Zone.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, I'm a little glad that you put it on the list of ones you would like to do because it is definitely one to like sick on someone. If I had just been like
yeah.
all willy nilly putting people on my list, and I'm very glad I didn't put Charlene Smith on here because that would have been awkward because she's done a few of these episodes, and if I just been
True.
citing it, I probably would have seen the plot and been like, oh, Natsu with that name, okay, let's not pair her with that episode anyway. So,
Right, right, right.
but
Yeah, no, no, I mean, first of all, it's such a good episode. I mean, spoiler before we get to the end of our conversation, it's such a good episode. But I also feel like in what we do with Mission Log, where we do take on some pretty heavy topics, this felt at home for me. So yeah, so I'm glad to do it. Thank you for
yeah,
letting me request this.
and I'll open up the Trek doors on this. I think people that are a little into Twilight Zone tend to also be into Star Trek. They kind of go
Yeah,
hand not necessarily go hand in hand, but they often
but
do. And
they overlap in many ways. Yeah.
and we'll definitely get into Deep Space Nine Gul Dukat because he's like Mickey Mouse compared to the fella in this guy
Boy,
in
no
this
kidding.
episode. But
No
still,
kidding. Yeah.
obviously, some universal truths or some character beats that are similar.
Yeah, for real.
Let me do a bit of the trivia for this one.
Yeah.
The original air date was November 10th, 1961, and the script is a Serling. We are close to the end of director Don Medford's run in the Twilight Zone. This is his fourth episode out of five. Oscar Berengi Jr. played SS Captain Lutz. We've already seen him in the Rip Van Winkle caper, and his claim to fame is as mobster Joe Kulak on TV's The Untouchables. In the context of this episode, it's probably worth noting that Berengi's father was a Hungarian Jew. I think that especially in the 60s when it was a especially touchy subject, I guess you usually cast people of Jewish descent as your Nazis, just as a,
Yeah. Yeah.
like we get it,
Yeah.
or
Right.
making it make, that's signaling that's probably worth doing.
Yeah. Exactly.
The specter of the Holocaust, Alfred Becker, was played by Joseph Schildkraut. He was known for
Hmm.
playing Otto Frank in stage in the 1959 film version of The Diary of Anne Frank, and won an Oscar for his supporting role in 1937's The Life of Emile Zola. Chances are the drama of this episode distracted you from the fact that this camp might look a little bit off. The set was actually repurposed from a Frontier Fort set that had been recently constructed on the MGM backlot for a failed TV Western pilot. It was just collecting dust there by this point. It cost almost $2 million in today's money to build, which would have been 200,000 at the time if you don't trust my math. So and my math was looking at wiki saying 1.6 million in 2016 and thinking, yeah, okay, that's enough inflation to say almost 2 million.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
um you have a bit of a tome today with the prologue, so which you
I
you have to
do.
have on your own computer, so
All right.
give
Well,
us a run of that.
away we go. Mr. Schmidt recently arrived in a small Bavarian village which lies 8 miles northwest of Munich, a picturesque, delightful little spot one time known for its scenery, but more recently related to other events having to do with some of the less positive pursuits of man: human slaughter, torture, misery, and anguish. Mr. Schmidt, as we will soon perceive, has a vested interest in the ruins of a concentration camp. For once, some 17 years ago, his name was Gunther Lutze. He held the rank of a captain in the SS. He was a black uniformed, strutting animal whose function in life was to give pain. And like his colleagues of the time, he shared the one affliction most common amongst that breed known as Nazis. He walked the earth without a heart. And now, former Captain SS Captain Lutz will revisit his old haunts, satisfied perhaps that all that is awaiting him in the ruins on the hill is an element of nostalgia. What he does not know, of course, is that a place like Dachau cannot exist only in Bavaria. By its nature, by its very nature, it must be one of the populated areas of the Twilight Zone.
Okay, my first thought is Judgment Nuremberg was 62, was it? I
Sounds
actually need to
about,
double check that. I'm trying to figure out
yeah.
chronologically if it came before or after this, because there's definitely a reference, or similar vibe between the two. um
Yes. Yeah. And, I was kind of thinking about the context of this being 1961. Obviously, Judgment at Nuremberg was pretty, yeah, pretty heavy representation of what actually went down in the popular culture. Of course, people followed the Nuremberg trials as they were happening. But in the pop culture, I feel like immediately after World War II, there were a lot of rah pro America movies. Let's celebrate the heroics. And it takes time. It takes something like this 10, 15, nearly 20 years later to really be reflective about what happened and get a little more at the ugly heart of what was going on there. So that's where you start to see shows like this, scripts like this, written by and performed by people who felt this acutely. But then I would also venture to say that a script like this probably would not be shot today, probably would not be made today.
no, yeah, I mean, you'd have to have like a committee on it, but whereas
Yeah.
this is, I mean, I know Serling had his run in with sponsors and stuff, like trying to edit what he was doing, but this one seems to come pretty good. I definitely wrote a few lines, I guess a few more lines of
Mhm.
dialogue than I usually do from this one.
Yeah.
First, I have in my notes the fun synchronicity is as soon as he said something like "I used to be a soldier," like in my head, I just said, you were never were a soldier," and then Becker
Uh,
says it on screen. I was like, okay, that's on the nose.
yes.
I
Yes.
love it when a script like you think something and then the script just instantly says it.
Yeah. Well,
That
this is a script where there is no subtext at all. I mean, everything that happens, every line that is spoken, every action that's taken, like everything is spelled out for you. Like the characters say exactly what they mean. And it's really rare to see that today because you always tell actors to play the subtext and what's on the page isn't always what's on screen. But with this, there's something really refreshingly straightforward about how this is written. Oh, and by the way, I don't know if you looked up Judgment at Nuremberg, but it did come out in 1968. And I think the US release date on that,
it's
ooh,
61 December 14th.
sorry, 61. Yeah.
Yeah. So this episode did actually come out first, but
Predated
maybe
it. Yeah.
I
Not by
imagine there might
much,
have been a
though.
few people, behind the scenes that might have known each other and
Oh,
shared a few
sure,
tidbits.
sure. Yeah. Well, and again, the Nuremberg trials started, I think they started in 1948. I can't remember if when they wrapped. I mean, they took years, but it was obviously something that was on people's minds. And it takes that time then to be reflective and put that in context, and particularly put it in this kind of emotional context that we have in this episode.
Yeah, a couple of the other quotes I wrote in here. One thing I think definitely would not be scripted this way a few years later is Lutzer kind of like coming out with a Lutz, excuse me, coming out with a "I have a dream" speech. That feels weird now.
Yeah, and you know what? That that moment feels odd. Like the glee that he has in reflecting on the good old days when he was the captain at this concentration camp. But then it has to be followed by what follows it, which is all the accusations from Becker and saying you're a sadist. And I'm glad he used that word, and I'm glad that he, again, like no subtext at all. Here's a guy walking into the situation enjoying the nostalgic thrill that he gets from it. And he needs this ghostly presence to point out it's like, no, you weren't a guy doing a job. You weren't a guy who was just a soldier. You were somebody who was there enjoying what you got out of it. And yeah, and Lutz does have this he's celebratory about what he thought the Third Reich would bring.
Like it took a second time watching this that the first couple scenes where he's just going around the camp by himself and reminiscing. Once you've seen the episode once, that becomes way more disturbing because you start to notice the glee. He at first, I mean, the first
Yeah.
time you watch it, you're like, okay, he's just like the good old days, but we haven't really gotten down what the good old days are until we get through the trial. So when
Yeah.
you watch it a second time, it's like he's so much more evil the second time you watch it. I mean, the
Yeah.
first time he's
For real.
already ridiculously, and that's the worst thing about this episode. It's not a mustache twirling villain. People in Nuremberg did respond this way on the
Yeah.
stands.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, people did have to rewrite their own personal histories because you can't be the villain. I guess that's the thing. You could do the worst
Right.
things ever, and you have to try and rewrite your past to not be the villain.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Going back to that point, the first time you watch it, you go, wait, why would anybody go back to the ruins of a concentration camp? Why? Because this is before a lot of these places, as they are now, that have become really important memorials to what happened. But this is 1961. This is before that happened. Um, and you're just sitting there going, why in the world would this guy go back there? But then it unfolds in front of you. Like you said, that second time around makes it even more sinister, really disturbing to see. And then that little, like, it's a little bit cheesy, but that little flashback where you see the young version of Lutz kind of over his shoulder wearing the SS uniform and the smile on his face while he's barking out orders. How twisted is it that that was where this guy feels like he peaked.
Right, because even a few years later on TV, it's like that little thing. It's like, well, now let's make it Colonel Clink and have a good laugh at it,
Yeah,
instead.
yeah,
Whereas it's like, no, that's not. It's not. I mean, it's on the surface. If you have no context, I guess it's funny, but because of the context, it's not funny at all.
yeah. Well, and you know what? I think that is a perfectly good way. Like we all have to deal with this kind of horror and historic trauma in different ways. And you can do this really disturbing piece like today's episode. You can also do Hogan's Heroes and deal with it that way. I think that is a legitimate way to kind of process that history. I mean, before we knew about the atrocities of what was happening at the camps, you had To Be or Not to Be, or you had The Great Dictator, or you had these other things that were making light of not making light of the fascist regime, but they were trying to poke holes in it with humor. So good for them. And I feel like this gives us a little taste of that, but it also adds to the sinister nature of Lutz by letting the audience be uh, uneasy at his happiness being there, in his mind being there.
I mean, I guess that's a Shield crowd as an actor. I mean, we keep talking about Lutz and Osperengi's quite good at that, but
Yeah,
Shield crowd as Becker is just like once he shows up, the key turns in this episode.
yeah, he's great, and everybody who's on the other side here, everybody who is sort of the ghostly image of the victims in the concentration camp, but Becker is the mouthpiece for them. He's so grounded. He's so still. He's so precise in his words and his movements, and clearly directed that way because this is a stylistic piece. It can't help but be a stylistic piece. It has to be. But I do love him in it, and I love how that is also reflected in the directorial choices, because a lot of what happens from the director is very straightforward. You're moving your actors from point A to point B to have a conversation or have a memory, have a confrontation. But there are a couple of places where you get thrown off a little bit, whether it's Lutz like turning from one direction, having a conversation with Becker, turning around, and Becker is just in the other place. He's just sort of like teleported like a ghost, he's just standing there, same kind of deadpan expression on his face, still carrying on the conversation. So a couple of moments like that are very effective. And then when Lutz runs to grab him, put his hands around his neck, and it's that jump cut to him grabbing a pole or the post in the yard there. Um, this episode isn't heavy-handed with that kind of thing. It's not trying to give you a jump scare. It's just there to make you feel uneasy, like you're on the same path of madness with Lutz. But yeah, sorry, back to your original point. uh, Becker is a fantastic role in this, and he is played perfectly.
I've got two more quotes. The first one sounds like something I would have written, but I put in quotations and I watched it again. So I know the first quote is "You didn't kill them hard enough" was a pretty
Uh,
wild line. I mean, is
yeah.
like what does that mean? If he was more horrible, he wouldn't have like that slight bit of guilt in his conscience coming back in this way.
Yeah, I thought about that line too because it was to me the interpretation of that is that if Lutz had any sort of if he had not been part of this mechanized death regime where it was so easy and so industrialized to dispose of people, that you literally could hit a button, cremate somebody's remains, and then they're buried in a shallow grave, and you don't think a second about doing it the next time and the next time and the next time. And I feel like my interpretation of Becker's line is that if that had been harder to do, if that had rested on your conscience at all, if you had to if you had to deal at all with the one-on-one inhumanity of taking somebody's life, then maybe we'd let you rest. But we're not going to, because it was so easy for you to kill one or 10,000. Didn't matter to him.
I mean, he reminisces directly in Becker's face, like, "Oh, when we used to string you up over there." It's like, you might. That's awkward. I mean, I
Yeah.
can't imagine, even if you had done that, I can't imagine bringing it up like that. But
Yeah.
that's where
Yeah.
this guy is. Um,
Oof.
the other one I quoted, which to me is well, just the standout line of the episode. That's where I'm like, this might be one of Serling's best scripts, at
Yeah.
least dialogue
Yeah.
wise. Is this is not hatred, this is retribution, this is not
Hmm.
revenge, this is justice. And
Yeah. Yeah. Again, like you said, just another great line in what is an incredibly powerful script. And I think that line needs to be in there because when you do a show like this, it could come across as looking like revenge. It could come across as looking like hatred from the people who were victimized. I mean, I would hope that nothing would come across that way. Uh, but I think it's necessary to kind of put the emotional button on where they're coming from because justice wasn't always served. Yes, the Nuremberg trials did happen, but there were people who got away, and there were people who weren't tried who maybe should have been. So I feel like we as the audience, particularly the audience in 1961 watching it, for whom this is very recent history and probably touched a lot of their families, they would also want to be able to look at this and say, yeah, it's not about revenge. It's about knowing, feeling like there is some sense of justice against something that was so utterly unjust and inhumane.
and numbers, it's a weird thing, I guess, with humans. Like, what can we accept for an atrocity? Like,
Yeah,
if say there's a murder in a house or something, that gets the news and everyone's like,
yeah,
oh, that person needs to be brought to justice. Whereas if you're responsible for the deaths of thousands, tens of thousands, and
yeah,
millions in the long run, but I'm going to stick with this one guy and say it's probably
yeah.
a couple thousand, right? Suddenly it's like we can't comprehend that. Like the idea of justice becomes like not quite as clear, weirdly, because it's too big to consider.
Well, it's like Captain Picard telling Kevin Uxbridge, we don't have a punishment to fit your crime. you know, so ever since this point in our history, and of course, not to be outdone by the Stalin regime and Pol Pot and other places where there have been mass killings. Um, it's not just about bringing the perpetrators to justice. It's also about trying to contextualize and wrap your minds around how this can happen so that it doesn't happen again. But then I just pointed out examples where it happened again. So we can't help but want to study this and try to understand as best we can too.
I'm going to go on a slightly weird route and go back in time. For some reason, I just had flashed in
Mm-hmm.
my mind, like, the Aztec things where they
Mm-hmm.
would march hundreds of basically prisoners of war up the pyramid, rip their heart out and throw them down the other side. And
Yeah.
in their mind, they were doing it so the sun would come up the next day.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
that's but that's
Yeah.
just as bad. But they
Yeah.
don't. I wouldn't have, and they might even have glee, like I'm making the sunrise, but they have a different motivation, and I don't know if that's a
Right.
humanity's evolving, and
Yeah.
these are really bad growing pains because in a way that's kind of worse, but at the same time they
Mm-hmm.
thought they in a really twisted mythological state of mind, they thought they were doing the right thing. I
Right.
did
Right.
this did Lutz think he was? I mean, did he ever think he was doing the right thing?
Yeah, it's that. Oh man, I mean that gets to the heart of it all, doesn't it? It's like the Nazis, on one count, they kept incredibly meticulous records, and they put this industrial scale killing machine into place. It became part of how that Reich worked, right? But at the same time, they engaged in propaganda to prevent other people from knowing that. So they knew that what they were doing was wrong, but they also were sort of making this just like so much other business. It's just like the collateral damage to get to the goal, to get to the other end. So I don't know, that those seem like contradictory things, but I guess they're both. I guess they're easy to do when you dehumanize another population, but then you realize that you are also on the world stage. You know, yeah, I'm saying these things, and again, I'm just sort of reinforcing how difficult it is to understand, how difficult it should be to understand by any compassionate, right-minded people.
Well, let's take it 30 years ahead because of course, just to lighten things for a few minutes, you did the deep dive through Deep Space Nine. They have Gul
Yeah,
Dukat, which basically is our sci-fi metaphor
yeah,
version um of Lynn's great Lutz, excuse me, great
yeah,
acting, great character, great show, but
yeah,
is it too milk toast? That, like you said, this episode is so direct. It's like,
yeah,
I mean, there's an episode DS9 where they kind of intimate like they have what Major Kira and Bill Ducat kind of flirting with each other. We'll have a little bit of fun, you know. Of course, he's in many episodes, so you can't do this for years at a time and really have an entertaining show of any kind. But
right. That would be too hard to watch. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was one of the things that I definitely can give credit to Deep Space Nine for is using that Cardassian regime as an analog for the Nazi regime, or you could insert other historical regimes like that, but clearly they were drawing a lot from World War II history as they fleshed them out. And Gul Dukat, among many other Cardassians that we met, and I always reference the episode Duet, where we talk about Gul Darheel, but we don't actually meet him. We meet one of the paper pushers who kept those good records. Um, but there were, among many who were treating the Bajorans the same way. But you watch an episode like this and you go, okay, it wasn't just that there was a Commandant Lutz, there were many like him. And there were many above him in the chain of command, and there were many below him in the chain of command who just carried this out either without a care in the world or maybe like as reflected in a guy like Lutz with a certain kind of joy, this really twisted, sadistic kind of joy. I don't know that we ever got that out of Gul Dukat. What we got was him using the machinery of war to his end. But the twisted thing about Gul Dukat was always wanted the people that he was subjugating to also like him. And that was a really bold character choice for the writers to apply onto him as well.
that's where
I think,
yeah,
yeah,
that's where I was kind of trying to get with here. Like, I think the thing that definitely threaded those two characters in my mind is they wanted to be loved by their victims. Like,
yeah, yeah,
Lutz seems surprised that he's up for a trial. He's like, "Oh, I remember you. Let's reminisce." And he's like, "That's not what we're doing, man." you
yeah,
know,
yeah. Yeah, this is not the good old days. Yeah. But just the very fact that he sees that as the good old days, like it's so utterly twisted. And that's where an episode like this is completely fascinating to me because you've heard me bring it up every now and then on Mission Log, but it's such an interesting idea to me where people end up after not just what they've done goes away, but their entire worldview goes away. There were many Nazis who were tried at Nuremberg, many who committed suicide, many who were put to death for war crimes. You also had a lot of rank and file soldiers who were just out there on the front lines fighting other soldiers. And yes, they were part of the regime, but they weren't doing this. Then you have guys like Lutz and either, again, people above or below him in the chain of command who use this excuse like, well, I was just following orders. I was just doing what I was told to do. It wasn't my call. It wasn't my fault. But what happens? What happens then if they somehow escape punishment and justice after the fact? Where do they go? What is their life like a year later or 5 years later or 20 years later? You spent, in this case, Dachau was open for 12 years. So imagine somebody spent 12 years of their life living, eating, and breathing this regime. Like that is their worldview. That is how they see their lives, their careers. And then one day, thank God, it's all taken away, it's all over. And if you live to see another day past, past the Allies liberating these places or past the Nuremberg trials, what do you do with your life? Who are you after that point? Some of these guys escaped to South America, which is what they said happened to Lutz, but for whatever, twisted motivation, he decided to come back to the fatherland just to check it out and reminisce. But I have a really hard time wrapping my mind around, well, what do you do when that thing that you lived is gone for good reason, but it was also part of your identity? I I don't know.
This is going to sound extremely disconnected when I start, but I swear it's connecting. A few
Please go
nights
right
ago,
ahead. I
a
love
few
this
nights
kind of thing.
a few nights ago, I put on the Bob Ross playlist to go to sleep with, right? And
Nice,
when I
nice.
woke up the next morning, I'd gone. I think I had what ASMR'd myself like 8 episodes. I was subliminally Bob Rossing myself. Anyway, the
Ah,
point is,
beautiful.
I'm
Yeah.
not sure how much you know about the man's history, but before he was a very chill painter on PBS, he was a drill instructor. So his job for
Wow,
a
wow.
decade or more was screaming in people's faces and hazing, not killing them. I'm not trying to convince,
No, no, no,
compare
no, no,
him
no, no.
to
Yeah.
Litz at all. But once he retired from the military, he was like, I'm not yelling at anyone ever again. Like that experience of dehumanizing people, not murdering them wholesale, but just
Yeah,
being
yeah.
in the business of dehumanizing people had enough on him that the joy of painting is sort of the response to
Wow,
I
wow.
guess a normal person version of this, where you're asked to do kind of bad things. Because even yesterday, I had a class. It's a bunch of 6, 7 year olds, and I hear them in the Japanese teachers room. They're screaming and going nuts, and I go and it's okay. It's time for class, and a 6 year old girl just screams in my face. So I was kind of like,
Oh
just
my
I
God.
had to go kind of drill instructor for a minute because I'm like, okay, if I go drill instructor now and just
Yeah,
like scare the bejesus out of them a little bit, the class will be fine. Which mostly was. I had one kid who couldn't
right.
sit in his chair, but otherwise it was like it was just sometimes a little bit of that,
Yeah,
controlled.
yeah.
Again, I wasn't pissed off. You do the Vulcan version where you just put on the display, but you're not feeling it, right?
Right, right, right.
so
See,
so
and I thought a bunch of, a room full of Japanese 6-year-olds would be very well behaved.
oh no. They don't really break them down to junior high.
Okay, okay, good to know.
Yeah, yeah. But
Yeah,
yeah, just for me, I was like, okay, I need to put on this little act. But I guess that was the thing. Like we were saying, it was like maybe weird comedy at the start that we're seeing him do his thing at the beginning, but he's so gleeful about it. He's so happy that he's doing it.
yeah.
Whereas I was like, I don't really want to yell at a kid and make them apologize to me, but this is a means to an end. And
Right,
they did
right.
just scream in my face. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so
That's very true. Yeah.
yeah, I guess it's like how much emotion is backing what you do, and this captain is just so gleeful about what he did, which is again,
Yeah.
he didn't kill him hard enough. He should have killed him and felt bad about it. I guess maybe that's the point.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, yeah. Right.
Um, I'm gonna rephrase the question a little bit and just say, did Luntz go through the Twilight Zone in this episode? He's
Yeah,
really the
I
only character, so did he go through the
right.
Twilight Zone?
Right, right. I mean, I guess for any character, I mean, this is what's so interesting about the Twilight Zone is there are so many episodes that just deal very directly with fate, and very often it could be either what is cosmically justified satisfied coming to that person, or it's something, twisted and unexpected that comes to that person. Maybe they didn't deserve. Maybe it is very fatalistic in a certain way. But this is one of those times where the universe is offering a kind of fate, a kind of justice to him, that is very satisfying for us, the audience, and is very satisfying for the people that he wronged in his life. There has to be a thing like the Twilight Zone for Lutz to go through in order to be able to literally face the ghosts of his past and literally be confronted by the people that he victimized in his past. He, by what we can put together of this story, he escaped the Allied liberation of the camp. In fact, Becker was the last person that he killed when he was trying to get out of the camp, or when he sensed that the Americans were close by. He escaped being tried at Nuremberg, and he escaped Europe, and he went to live somewhere in South America for the last 17 years. So he has escaped all these points where he would have been held accountable for what he did. So now you have to have a thing like the Twilight Zone come along. You have to have this thing for our own sense of justice and morality in the universe to be able to take him, force him to be confronted by the souls of the people that he wronged, even though that was a very small room, and we're talking about thousands probably that he perpetrated. Um, so yes, he is the one who went through the Twilight Zone. Becker and people like Becker are sort of stuck in the Twilight Zone. Maybe this is the thing that gets them out of it. Maybe they can rest peacefully now that this job is done, or maybe they have more to go. I'm not sure. Um, but yes, yeah, he is the one who went through because he had to go through.
I want to replace for my answer. I want to not replace, move the location of the Twilight Zone a bit.
Okay.
So I'd like to go with he went to this. He returned to the scene of his crimes and
Yeah.
actually went nuts over 2 hours. Like that's all him. The Twilight Zone
Oh,
is simply
yeah.
him deciding to go back to the scene of his crime. Why would he do that?
Yeah, that is pretty twisted.
I like
But
the idea
see,
that the Twilight Zone nudges him, and then
yeah,
it's him that is doing this to himself because he has to.
yeah. See, I like that. I mean, the Twilight Zone is the kind of show where I like to, I kind of turn off my scientific analytical mind and I just think like, okay, there is this supernatural thing, the Twilight Zone, that sort of, you know, sweeps people toward this, fatalistic justice that they are owed. But I'm really glad that you brought it up the way that you did because and we've had this conversation before many times, like to me, the non supernatural believer or supernatural non believer that I am, like, I like to think that that is the thing that happens to that guy's brain chemistry is that he has spent 17 years just running from his crimes, that eventually, even if the authorities don't catch up with him, his own psyche will catch up with him. Whatever little glimmer was in his brain that has any sense that what he did was a horror, then it will force him into madness. So I really like that interpretation too.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously playing a Twilight Zone imagery in his experience at the camp too. So,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not saying this is a non Twilight Zoney episode. Just that, yeah, sometimes you want to stare reality in the face a little bit when reality is too real.
Yeah. Well, but you know what, that is the kind of thing that yeah, whether whether we can chalk it up to like a supernatural intervention or not, that is the kind of thing that we all do. We walk into a place where we were before, and as those memories flood back, we see those things. So how could he not walk into that courtyard and see those gallows and then picture the people who were there? So that is a very naturalistic thing to happen. Where it goes off the deep end is when they start talking back to him.
Yeah. So usually at this point, I'm like, do they deserve it? Which my note, quoting you a little bit, is you could call this episode "Bonk Bonk on the Head," but it's probably the most necessary bonk bonk on the head. So I actually want to change this question a little bit too, because coming up, I mean, I really feel like I don't even feel comfortable asking that question in this episode. So is it possible to grant this guy forgiveness?
Oh, see, and again, you're asking the questions that I asked myself, and that's where I go back to this thing about how do we deal with people who had wrong ideas, bad ideas, made their way through it? Do we write them off entirely and say that they are unforgivable, they can't change, therefore they have to be put away or driven to madness or whatever? Yes, I mean, I'm not advocating that people should not be punished, because people do need to be punished and justice needs to be served. Um, I think what this episode does very effectively is serve, like I was saying before, as that kind of sense of justice for us, for the people who escaped military justice at the time and legal justice at the time. So he deserves his madness, because he deserves at least to have gone through being confronted by what he did, being confronted by the voices of the people that he wronged. Um, is that justice? Well, I think it is for the people who need to witness that.
Yeah, I think it's important that he doesn't just die at the end, right?
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah,
for another Star Trek reference, it seems his brain has now snapped himself into the mirror universe's agonizer for
yeah,
for the rest of his however long he lives. So, which
yeah,
I mean, I guess that's justice. I mean, I'm sitting here, okay, we execute some Nazi war criminals. I'm like, I don't know. Do we? I mean, I'm pretty anti-death penalty, so I'm like, should we execute
yeah.
anybody? I mean,
Well, and I am too. Yeah, and you know, again, you're getting into very complicated things about like what is their psychology, what is their motivation. For so many of the people who said they were just following orders, well, what if some of them were? What if a lot of them weren't? You can't truly know somebody else's mind in that sense. Um, so I like the idea that madness means that he actually mentally has to confront what he did. Like there's the breaking point. It was so easy for the first, however old he is, let's say he's about 45. Let's say that for the first 45 years of his life, he didn't have to care, and he didn't care about the people that he tortured and murdered. But now, if he lives another 40 years plus, now he is going to be haunted by that sense of justice, is that will be in his head. Now he will be institutionalized, so he can't be out on the street, fortunately. He will be institutionalized, and that will be the tape playing in his head all day long, is feeling in a very visceral. By the way, those scenes of him kind of stumbling out of the what do they call it, the detention room, and then stumbling across the courtyard, those were very visceral, and you just think like, okay, he's going to be feeling that now for the rest of his life. That maybe that's fair.
yeah, several weeks ago we covered the arrival, which had the
Hmm.
plane inspector who had, it seemed, I mean, by end of he had been basically like delusion dazed going around the airport for the past 15 years because he couldn't solve a case,
Yeah,
which is kind of the
yeah,
opposite. Like that guy, you feel bad he got driven to madness,
yeah,
because
right,
he just kind of,
right.
yeah, he didn't do his job, or I mean, he probably did do his job right. He just didn't have the end result he wanted. So that's the opposite, where you feel bad for that guy. But yeah, this guy, you're like, well, He's where he needs to be now, I guess, because
Yeah.
of I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know. Can he learn from that experience in the metaphysical sense of the word? I don't know. In the nuts and bolts mechanical universe sense of the word, yeah, that's just, again, it's not revenge, it's just justice.
Right. Right.
Um, it
Oof.
almost feels flippant to ask about the tripometer in this episode, but I ask in every episode. So let's tripometer it from 0 to 5.
Oh man. Here's the thing. I could answer that question as either a five or a zero. It is either one of those things. Because yes, it is trippy. First of all, it is trippy to spend half an hour with this character. It is trippy to just have laid bare his psychology for half an hour. That is, again, this episode would not be written today, it would not be produced today, it would not resemble this at all. So it is a trippy experience to just go through the story with him. At the same time, I would say that it is a zero because this is so utterly real. Like, there is not a science fiction twist to this at all. This is just a person rightfully haunted by the horrors of his past. And and to the point that it drives him to madness. I don't think that there is a way that I can feel sympathy for Lutz now, but I can definitely see the tragedy of his life in so many ways. It was tragic before, and it's going to be nothing but tragic now. And thank goodness, like I said, he's out of circulation in the rest of the world.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
a bad answer. That was a
No,
bad answer because I didn't answer your question. I honestly don't know where to land. But you know what? I'm going to come back and I'm going to say that it's zero. That it's not trippy. It is just harsh reality.
yeah. No, one, I was about to bring up another point that I realized might be a little spoilery, so I'm going to sit on that. Maybe talk to you when we're finished with this. Um,
Okay.
but
Okay.
no, we've had more and more episodes recently that are it's a 0 or a 5. The silence is it was
Oh.
definitely one where you're like, in that one we were like, oh, this is intense, this is dark, and that doesn't hold a candle to this one.
Right.
So
Right.
I'm going to give it a -5. It's a really bad trip.
Oh, yeah. It is a bad trip if your looks. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you have any other final points you want to throw out on this one?
No, just I think we covered everything that I was thinking about it. I would just say, well, actually, two things. One, if you read the trivia at IMDb, it is woefully inaccurate. So, if you watch this episode, please do a little bit of your own research about Dachau and about the Nuremberg trials and people like Lutz. I mean, you could say that he is very loosely based on any number of SS who were stationed at these concentration camps. Um, I think this episode is required viewing. It is a terrific episode of The Twilight Zone. And there are many episodes of The Twilight Zone that are influenced by Rod Serling's experience in World War II and the cultural experience of World War II, because, we're 15 years away from it at this point and still picking up the pieces in the late 50s, early 60s. Um, but I think just as a piece of television, this also is required viewing because it is produced, directed, and acted so well. I love the efficiency of the Twilight Zone. That is a word that I have used on your show many times because they get across so much in a half an hour. And there's nothing wasted in this episode. And I just so appreciate the harsh reality of what's in here. It's not one that you can just kind of walk away and go like, oh, it was a weird alien thing, and there's interesting metaphors about life. Like, no, there's no metaphor here. It just is what happened played out in this very interesting way.
I,
So I highly encourage it.
I don't think you can marathon this episode. I don't think you should watch this one like in a run of several Twilight Zone episodes. I think you
No,
got
no,
to
no, 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 no,
isolate
no,
this
no.
one.
Yeah.
Um, because you
agreed.
could, some episodes circling this one. We got the Midnight Sun, the Passerby. I mean, you can just like let them roll
Yeah,
by, watch a few. It's fun, do
yeah,
something else.
yeah,
But this one sort of, it requires your attention and it requires your
yeah.
thought, and you can't just binge it, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny. At the end of this, I watched the little the Rod Serling intro for next week for the Midnight Sun, and that's always an episode that's going like, oh, okay, I remember that one. I don't need to watch it again. I think it's a good episode. Well, I think they're all good episodes, but that's one that I kind of remember the beats, and I'm just like, yeah, okay. But this one, like you said, this one requires attention.
Just a spoiler because it's
Yeah.
next week, but that's my spoiler, so I can do it. Midnight Sun actually is maybe my favorite episode or in my top five, but
Oh, right on. Okay, well then I
Mark,
have to listen
no,
to it.
no, Mark
Yeah.
is on with me for that one, and he
Yeah.
notes at some point it's like you say it's your favorite, but you keep punching holes into it. It's like I'm just trying to test it,
Yeah. Right, right,
road
right.
test it. But I think that's
Yeah.
important. You're like, I really like
Yeah.
this. Why and why? What are the flaws that I don't care about? So,
Yeah. I mean, look, I love it when we do that on Mission Log. Like we'll just sit there and poke holes in an episode and get to the end and go like, okay, but this is really enjoyable. That's fine. That's
yeah,
totally
yeah.
fine. Yeah.
There's been once or twice when I thought that was a dumpster fire of an episode, and I listened to your
Yeah.
conversation. I think you guys agree, and at the end, no, we actually liked him. Like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, interesting.
Right.
But
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of hard to throw shade on Death's Head Revisited. So,
Yeah. Phew.
again, I mean, our this is probably the least trippy conversation I've had on this particular podcast. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess this is Aaron about May for Mission Log. So any idea, any
Let's see. Not sure
what up on
where
that?
we will be. We just recorded Coda. That I think went really well. That kind of spoiler had like the opposite effect, where we both sat there and went, "Okay, wow, this is a great episode. Like everything is firing on all cylinders. The writing is interesting. The twists are good. The production value is good. The acting is great." But does it really hold up? you know, like you sound like a hypocrite saying that, but that'll be out in about 3 weeks. So yeah, coming up around the same time, coming up early May. And then I have to get to work on the next one. So yeah, and then by end of April, early May, we'll be done with our Picard coverage and just going into like a recap and probably a special guest celebrity interview after that. So join us on Mission Log Live for that.
Alrighty. As for this, it's Time Enough Podcast. It's Time Enough Pod on Twitter and Facebook. We hang out on Patreon at Podcastius, where you can get episodes early, add a little support to pay the bills, that sort of thing. We've just started the Films and Filth podcast, where we're looking at the top 100 on IMDb and the bottom 100, alternating between if things are films or filth. One of
Man,
our
that
hosts
is the most inspired, bizarre idea, and I love it.
and one of our hosts hates rating systems. So just but it's just
Fantastic.
a weird arbitrary list to follow. It's fun.
Yeah, yeah, why not? Why
Uh,
not?
I call it Disney. We talk about weird magic and possible conspiracy theories in Disney from two guys who like these films, by the way. We're not trying to push holes
Nice.
into it. We're just like, hey, what's here?
Love it. I
The
love it.
video game stuff with Luke Loves Pokemon, Hyrule Field Report about the Zelda games, and the Game Show, which is a couple of British guys quizzing each other and screaming at each other and insulting. Actually, you know what? There's not that much screaming, more just insulting, I guess, is the thing.
That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah. Geez, I can't do a witty sign off for this episode, so I guess I'll
No.
just say see you next week. Okay. The one thing I was going to bring up for the spoiler, which would have been an
Yeah, yeah.
interesting conversation, but the Orville novel from last year. I don't know if you actually got around to reading that.
I
But
haven't. No, no. What
okay,
about it?
I would chase this episode with that because that adds a very interesting twist
Oh,
to this. Especially
okay.
like, can you forgive this guy? It becomes a much trickier question if you read that book.
Wow. Okay. Interesting.
So
Interesting. All right.
and before I let you off, I
Yeah,
wanted
yeah.
to there's a few things temporally that are coming close that you're interested in. So I want to kind of nail
Yeah.
down what you're actually interested in and what
Yeah,
kind of
yeah, yeah, yeah.
availability you have.
What we got? Yeah.
Twilight Zone, this one airs, like I said, second or third week of May. I can't quite remember. And then Still
Okay.
Valley's 2 weeks after that. And Once Upon a
Okay.
Time's 2 weeks after that. And then Citizen Kane, which is for me the priority to get you on for, um,
Ooh, I
is
love it.
is early June release. So I guess I don't know if you have
Okay.
more time, less time at the moment because of circumstances, but
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know that I'm going to be here at least through, like, I'll be leaving Birmingham at the earliest, like May 2nd or 3rd, but honestly, I think it's going to be more like May 5th when I leave, 5th or 6th when I leave. So we could plan something for like last week of April.
okay. Um Maybe today is it's the 12th for you.
Yeah.
26th might
Okay.
be a good one.
26 for me.
Yes,
Yeah.
26.
Okay.
I think same time because I imagine you don't want to start earlier than this.
Yeah, yeah. Because I mean, we're usually getting my dad out of the house to do physical therapy like early afternoon, and then we'll come back and have like not too early dinner, but like 6, 7 o'clock. So 8 o'clock is good for me
Okay,
to be able to do that.
I'll go
Yeah.
ahead and make a Zoom for that. Well, I need to actually. That's the one where I actually now have two co-hosts that are there most weeks. So
Oh, okay.
we just added on
Nice.
Mark as a regular, so we'll have the full gospel for Citizen Kane. Should be a very pretentious
Nice.
podcast.
Wait, remind me the name of that show again.
Films and filth.
Films and Filth, of course.
So I got 2 episodes up right now, which is Ikiru, Akira Kurosawa's Ikiru.
Oh, cool.
I just posted actually to the Discord in the 2000 science fiction a link to 2001: A Space Travesty with Leslie Nielsen. Um,
Yes.
Leslie Nielsen comes out fine in that. I think the thing is the genius of his shtick is it doesn't matter if the jokes are bad because
Mm.
he's just there for jokes to bounce off of. So it's not his fault if
Yeah.
they're bad jokes.
Right. Right.
So
That's true.
he's still great in it. But yeah, there is a fair amount of snark about the film in general. And
Nice. Good.
uh,
Good.
then M, we recorded M,
Oh, cool. Yeah.
followed by Ballistic X versus Sever,
Jesus.
followed by North
Uh,
by Northwest, which we're doing with
oh,
Captain Mike tomorrow.
hell yes. All right. I can't wait to listen to that.
So yeah, it's just a
He
kind of
better
a
love that film. He
I
better.
pretty he requested it, and I don't
Okay.
remember if I mentioned it to you or not, but everyone I've sent the list to requested the Flintstones Viva Rock Vegas.
Oh,
I've
sweet
sent it to like
Jesus.
8 people, and all 8 wanted it.
Wow. Wow.
So
Unreal.
yeah, but I do have
Unreal,
to watch
dude.
the Human Centipedes 2 and 3 now, which I don't know if I'm happy about that or not.
You're a braver man than I.
But I don't
Wow.
watch the first one. We're not watching the first one because it's not on the list. We do Toy Story
Okay, there
1,
you
Toy
go.
Story 3, but not Toy Story 2
Not
because it's not
two.
on the list.
Not
Yeah.
on the list. Okay. I
Okay.
hear you.
Anyway, I'll
All
go ahead
right,
and get
man.
that in the docket. And thanks
Cool.
as
All
always for
right.
your time, especially under different kinds of circumstances.
Yeah,
So
thanks, man. I appreciate it. All right.
catch you
Take care.
later.
You have